sad, dark thing. Aimless, a short, simple word. It meant without aim, where aim derives from the idea of calculation with a view to action, without purpose or direction, therefore lacking considered goal or future that you can see. People mainly use the word in a blunt, softened fashion. They walk aimlessly down a street, not sure whether to have a coffee or if they should check out the new magazines in the bookstore, or maybe sit on that bench and watch the world go by. It's not a big deal, this aimlessness. It's a temporary state. Often comes with a side order of ease. An hour without something hanging over you. No great need to do or achieve anything in particular. In this world of busy lives and do this and do that, sounds pretty good. But being wholly without purpose, with no direction home, this is not such a good deal. Being truly aimless is like being dead. It may even be the same thing, or worse. It is the aimless who find the wrong roads and drive down them simply because they have nowhere else to go. Miller usually found himself driving on Saturday afternoons. He could make the morning go away by staying in bed an extra half hour, tidying away stray emails, spending time on the deck, looking out over the forest with a magazine or the iPad and a succession of coffees. He made the coffees in a machine that sat on the kitchen counter, cost nearly $800. Made a very good cup of coffee. It should. It cost nearly $800. By noon, a combination of caffeine and other factors would mean that he wasn't very hungry. He would go back indoors nonetheless, put together a plate from the fridge. The ingredients would be the things he'd gathered from delis up in San Francisco during the week, or else from the New Leaf markets in Santa Cruz or Felton as he returned home on Friday afternoon. The idea was that this would constitute a treat and remind him of the good things in life. That was the idea. He would also pour some juice into one of the only 2 glasses in the cabinet that got any use. The other was a Scotch glass, the one with the faded white logo on it. That only came out in the evenings. He was very firm about that. He would bring the plate and glass back out and eat at the table which stood further along the deck from the chair in which he'd spent most of the morning. By then the sun would have moved around and the table got shade, which he preferred when he was eating. The change in position was also supposed to make it feel like he was doing something different to what he'd done all morning, though it did not, especially. He was still a man sitting in silence on a raised deck within view of many trees, eating expensive food that tasted like cardboard. Afterward, he took the plate indoors and washed it in the sink. He had a dishwasher, naturally. Dishwashers were there to save time. He washed the plate and silverware by hand, watching the water swirl away, then drying everything and putting it to one side. He was down a wife and a child, now living 300 miles away. He was short on women and children, therefore, but in their place, from the hollows they left behind, he had time. Time crawled in an endless parade of minutes from between those cracks, arriving like an army of little black ants, crawling up over his skin, up his face, into his mouth, ears, and eyes. So why not wash the plate, and the knife, and the fork, and the glass? Hold back the ants for a few minutes at least. He never left the house with a goal. On those afternoons, he was truly aimless. Where the house stood high in the Santa Cruz Mountains, he could have reached a number of diverting places within an hour or two: San Jose, Saratoga, Santa Cruz itself, and south to Monterey, Carmel, Big Sur, even way down to Los Angeles, if he felt like making a weekend of it. And then what? Instead, he simply drove. There are only so many major routes you could take through the area's mountains and redwood forests. Highways 17 and 9, the road out over to Bonnie Doon, Route 1, north or south. Of these, only 17 is of any real size. In between the main thoroughfares, however, there are other options. Roads that don't do much except connect one minor 2-lane highway to another. Roads that used to count for something before modern alternatives came along to supplant or supersede or negate them. Side roads, old roads, forgotten roads. Usually there wasn't much to see down these. Stretches of forests, maybe a stream, eventually a house, well back from the road. Rural, mountainous backwoods where the trees and poison oak reigned supreme. Chains across tracks which led down or up into the woods, some gentle inclines, others pretty steep, meandering off towards some house which stood even further from the through lines, back in a 20 or 50 acre lot. Every now and then you'd pass one of the area's very few tourist traps, like the Mystery Spot, an old-fashioned affair which claimed to honor a site of unfathomable weirdness, but in fact paid cheerful homage to geometry and a man's willingness to be deceived. He'd seen all those long ago. The local attractions with his wife and child, the shadowed roads and tracks on his own solitary excursions over the last few months. At least you might have thought he would have seen them all. Every Saturday he drove, however. Every time he found a road that he'd never seen before. Today the road was off Bragford Drive, the long old highway which heads off through the largely uncolonized regions of the mountains and forests to the southeast of Scotts Valley. As he drove north along it, mind elsewhere and nowhere, he noticed a turning. A glance in the rearview mirror showed no one behind, so he slowed to peer along the turn. A 2-lane road, everything with tall trees, overhung with tall trees, including some redwoods, gave no indication of leading anywhere at all. Fine by him. He made the turn and drove on. The trees were tall and thick, cutting off much of the light from above. The road passed smoothly up and down, riding the natural contours, curving abruptly once in a while to avoid the trunk of an especially big tree or to skirt a small canyon carved out over millennia by some small and bloody-minded stream. There were no houses or other signs of habitation. Could be public land, he was beginning to think, though he didn't recall there being any around here and hadn't seen any indication of a park boundary. And then he saw a sign by the road up ahead. Stop. That's all it said. Despite himself, he found he was doing just that, pulling over towards it. When the car was stationary, he looked at the sign curiously. It had been hand-lettered some time ago, in black marker on a panel cut from a cardboard box and nailed to a tree. He looked back the way he'd come, then up the road once more. He saw no traffic in either direction. Also no indication of why the sign would be here. Sure, the road curved again about 40 yards ahead, no more markedly than it had 10 or 15 times since he'd left Bragford Drive. There had been no warning signs on these bends. If you simply wanted people to observe the speed limit, then you'd be more likely to advise them to slow. And anyway, it didn't look at all like an official sign. Then he realized that further on, there was in fact a turning off the road. He took his foot off the brake and let the car roll forward down the slope, crunching over twigs and gravel. A driveway, it looked like, though a long one, bending off into the trees, single lane, roughly made up. Maybe 5 yards down it was another sign, evidently the work of the same craftsman as the previous. Tourists welcome. He grunted in something like a laugh. If you had yourself some kind of attraction, of course tourists were welcome. What would be the point otherwise? It was a strange way of putting it. An odd way of advertising it, too. No indication of what was in store, or why a busy family should turn off what was already a pretty minor road and head off into the woods. No lure, except those 2 words. They were working on him, though, he had to admit. He eased his foot gently back on the gas, carefully directed the car along the track between the trees. After about a quarter of a mile, he saw a building ahead, a couple of them, in fact, arranged in a loose compound. One a ramshackle 2-story farmhouse, the other a disused barn. There was also something that was or had been a garage, with a broken-down tractor parked diagonally in front of it. It was parked insofar as it was not moving, at least not in the sense that whoever had last driven the thing had made an effort when abandoning it to align its form with anything. The surfaces of the vehicle were dusty and rusted, liberally covered in old leaves and specks of bark. A wooden crate about 4 feet square stood rotting in the back. The near front tire was flat. The track ended in a widened parking area big enough for 4 or 5 cars. It was empty. There was no sign of life at all. In fact, but something, he wasn't sure what, said this habitation was a going concern, rather than a collection of ruins that someone had walked away from at some point in the last few years. Nailed to a tree in front of the main house was another cardboard sign, "Welcome." He parked, turned off the engine, and got out. It was very quiet. Usually is in these mountains when you're away from the road. Sometimes you'll hear the faint roar of an airplane way up above, but apart from that, it's just the occasional tweet of some winged creature or an indistinct rustle as something small and furry or scaly makes its way through the bushes. He stood for a few minutes, flapping his hands to discourage a noisy fly which appeared from nowhere, bothered his face, and then zipped chaotically off. Eventually he called out, "Hello!" You'd think that on what was evidently a very slow day for this attraction, whatever it was, the sound of an arriving vehicle would have someone bustling into sight, eager to make a few bucks, to pitch their wares. He stood a few minutes more, however, without seeing or hearing any sign of life. He figured, aimless people find aimless things. It didn't seem like much was going to happen here. You find what you're looking for, and he hadn't been looking for anything at all. He looked back towards the car, whether he wasn't even feeling disappointment. He hadn't expected much. That's exactly what he got. As he held up his hand to press the button to unlock the doors, however, he heard a creaking sound. He turned back to see there was now a man on the tilting porch that ran along half the front of the wooden house. He was dressed in canvas jeans and a vest that had probably once been white. The man had probably once been clean, too, though he looked now like he'd spent most of the morning trying to fix the underside of a car. Perhaps he had. "What you want?" His voice was flat and unwelcoming. He looked to be in his mid to late 50s. Hair once black was now half gray, also none too clean. He did not look like he'd been either expecting or desirous of company. "What have you got?" The man on the porch leaned back on the rail and kept looking at him, but said nothing. "It says tourist welcome," Miller said when it became clear the local had nothing to offer. "I'm not feeling especially welcome, to be honest." The man on the porch looked weary. "Christ. Boy was supposed to take down those damn signs. They still up?" "Yes." "Even the one out on the road says stop?" "Yes," Miller said. "Otherwise I wouldn't have stopped." The other man swore and shook his head. "Told the boy weeks ago. Told him I don't know how many times." Miller frowned. "You don't notice when you drive in and out that the signs are still there?" "Haven't been to town in a while." "Well, look, I turned down your road because it looked like there was something to see." "Nope. Doesn't say anything like that." "It's implied, though, wouldn't you say?" The man lifted his chin a little. "You a lawyer?" "No, I'm a businessman with time on my hands. Is there something to see here or not?" After a moment, the man on the porch straightened and came walking down the steps. $1, he said, "as you're here." "For what, the parking?" The man stared at him as if he was crazy. "No, to see." $1? Seemed inconceivable that in this day and age there would be anything under the sun for $1, especially if it was trying to present as something worth experiencing. "Really? That's cheap," the man said, misunderstanding. "It is what it is," Miller said, getting his wallet out and pulling a dollar bill from it. The other man laughed, a short, sour sound. "You got that right." After he'd taken the dollar and stuffed it into one of the pockets of his jeans, the man walked away. Miller took this to mean that he should follow, and so he did. Looked for a moment as if he were headed towards the house, and then the path, such as it was, took an abrupt right onto a course that led them between the house and the tilting barn. The house was large and gabled, must once have been quite something. Lord knows what it was doing out here, lost by itself in a patch of forest that had never been near a major road or town or any place else that people with money might wish to be. Its glory days were long behind it anyway. Looking up at it, you'd give it another 5 years standing, unless someone got on to rebuilding, or at least shoring it right away. The man led the way through slender trunks into an area around the back of the barn. Though the land in front of the house and around the side had barely been what you'd think of as tamed, here the forest abruptly came into its own. Trees of significant size shot up all around, looking, as redwoods do, like they'd been there since the dawn of time. A sharp, rocky incline led down towards a stream about 30 yards away. The stream was perhaps 8 feet across, with steep sides. A rickety bridge of old gray wood lay across it. The man led him to the near side of this and then stopped. "What?" "This is it." Miller looked again at the bridge. $1 to look at a bridge some guy threw up 50 years ago? Suddenly it wasn't seeming so dumb a pricing system after all. The man handed him a small tarnished key, raised his other arm to point. Between the trees on the other side of the creek was a small hut. "It's in there." "What is?" The man shrugged. A sad, dark thing. The water which trickled below the bridge smelled fresh and clean. Miller got a better look at the hut, shed, whatever, when he reached the other side. It was about half the size of a log cabin, but made of gray, battered planks instead of logs. The patterns of lichen over the sides and the moss-covered roof said it had been here in this form for a good long time, far longer than in the house, most likely. Could be an original settler's cabin, the home of whichever long ago pioneer had first arrived here, driven west by hope or desperation. Looked about contemporary with the rickety bridge, certainly. There was a small padlock on the door. He looked back. The other man was still standing at the far end of the bridge, looking up at the canopy of leaves above. It wasn't clear what he was looking at. It didn't seem like he was waiting for the right moment to rush over, bang the other guy on the head, and steal his wallet. If he wanted to do that, he could have done it back at the house. There was no sign of anyone else around. This boy he'd mentioned, for example. He looked like he was waiting patiently for the conclusion of whatever needed to happen for him to have earned his dollar. Miller turned back and fitted the key in the lock. It was stiff, but it turned. He opened the door. Inside was total darkness. He hesitated, looking back across the bridge, but the man had gone. He opened the door further and stepped inside. The interior of the cabin was cooler than it had been outside, but also stuffy. There was a faint smell. Not a bad smell, particularly. It was like old damp leaves. It was like the back of a closet where you store things you do not need. It was like a corner of the attic of a house not much loved in the night after rain. The only light was that which managed to get past him from the door behind. The cabin had no windows, or if it had, they had been covered over. The door he'd entered by was right at one end of the building, which meant the rest of the interior led ahead. It could only have been 10, 12 feet. It seemed longer because it was so dark. The man stood there, not sure what happened next. The door slowly swung closed behind him, not all the way, but leaving a gap of a couple of inches. No one came and shut it on him and turned the lock or started hollering about he'd have to pay $1,000 to get back out again. The man waited. In a while, there was a quiet sound. It was a rustling, not quite a shuffling, a sense of something moving a little at the far end, turning away from the wall, perhaps. Just after the sound, there was a low waft of a new odor, as if the movement had caused something to change its relationship to the environment, as if a body long held curled or crouched in a particular shape or position had realigned enough for hidden sweat to be released into the unmoving air. Miller froze. In all his life, he'd never felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. You read about it, hear about it. He knew they were supposed to do it, but he'd never felt it, not his own hairs on his own neck. They did it then, though. The peculiar thing was that he was not afraid, or not only that. He was in there with something. That was for certain. It was not a known thing, either. It was, he didn't know. He wasn't sure. He just knew that there was something over there in the darkness. Something about the size of a man, he thought, maybe a little smaller. He wasn't sure it was male, though. Something said to him it was female. He couldn't imagine where this impression might be coming from, as he couldn't see it, and he couldn't hear anything either. After the initial movement, it had been still. There was just something in the air that told him things about it that said, underneath the shadows, it wrapped around itself like a pair of dark angels' wings. It knew despair, bitter madness, and melancholy, better even than he did. He knew that beneath those shadows it was naked and not male. He knew also that it was this and not fear that was making his breathing come ragged and forced. He stayed in there for half an hour, doing nothing, just listening, staring into the darkness but not saying anything. That's how long it seemed like it had been, anyway, when he eventually emerged back into the forest. It was hard to tell. He closed the cabin door behind him, but he did not lock it because he saw that the man was back, standing once more at the far end of the bridge. Miller clasped the key firmly in his fist and walked over towards him. "How much?" he said. "For what? You already paid." "No," Miller said. "I want to buy it." It was 8 by the time Miller got back to his house. He didn't know how that could be unless he'd spent longer in the cabin than he realized. It didn't matter a whole lot. In fact, there were good things about it. The light had begun to fade. In 20 minutes, it would be gone entirely. He spent those minutes sitting in the front seat of the car, waiting for darkness, his mind as close to a comfortable blank as it had been in a long time. When it was finally dark, he got out of the car and went over to the house. He dealt with the security system, unlocked the front door, and left it hanging open. He walked back to the vehicle, went around to the trunk, rested his hand on the metal there for a moment, and it felt cold. He unlocked the back and turned away, not fast but naturally, walked towards the wooden steps which led to the smaller of the two raised decks. He walked up them and stood there for a few minutes, looking out into the dark stand of trees, then turned and headed back down the steps toward the car. The trunk was empty now, so he shut it and walked slowly towards the open door of his house and went inside and shut and locked that door behind him too. It was night and it was dark, and they were both inside, and that felt right. He poured a small scotch in a large glass. He took it out through the sliding glass doors to the chair on the main deck where he'd spent the morning, sat there cradling the drink, taking a sip once in a while. He found himself remembering, as he often did at this time, the first time he'd met his wife. He'd been living on East Cliff then, in a house which was much smaller than this one, but only a couple minutes' walk from the beach. Late one Saturday afternoon, bored and restless, he'd taken a walk to the Crow's Nest, the big restaurant that was the only place to eat or drink along that stretch. He bought a similar scotch at the upstairs bar, taking it out onto the balcony to watch the sun go down over the harbor. After a while, he noticed that amongst the family groups of sunburned tourists and knots of tattooed locals, there was a woman sitting at a table by herself. She had a tall glass of beer, seemed to be doing the same thing he was, and he wondered why. Not why she was doing that, but why he was, why they both were. He did not know then, and he did not know now, why people sit and look out into the distance by themselves, or what they hope to see. After a couple more drinks, he went over and introduced himself. Her name was Catherine. She worked at the university. They got married 18 months later, and though by then, his business having taken off in the meantime, he could have afforded anywhere in town, they hired the Crow's Nest, had the wedding party there. A year after that, their daughter was born, and they called her Matilda, after Catherine's mother, who was French. Business was still good. They moved out of his place on East Cliff and into the big house he had built in the mountains, and for 7 years all was good. And then, for some reason, it was no longer good anymore. He didn't think it had been his fault, though it could have been. He didn't think it was her fault either, though that too was possible. It had simply stopped working. They'd been two people, and then one, and then two again, facing different ways. There'd been a view to share together, then there was not, and if you look with only one eye, then there is no depth of field. There'd been no infidelity. In some ways that might have been easier. It would have been something to react to blame, to hide behind. Far worse, in fact, to sit on opposite sides of the breakfast table, wonder who the other person was, why they were there, and when they would go. 6 months later, she did. Matilda went with her, of course. He didn't think there was much more that could be said or understood on the subject. When first he'd sat down on this deck alone, trying to work it all out through his head, the recounting could take hours. As time went on, the story seemed to get shorter and shorter. As they said around these parts, it is what it is, or it was what it was. Time passed, and then it was late. The scotch was long gone. He didn't feel the desire for any more. He took the glass indoors and washed it in the sink, putting it on the draining board next to the plate and the knife and the fork from lunch. No lights were on. He hadn't bothered to flick any switches when he came in. Having sat for so long out on the deck, his eyes were accustomed. He felt no need to turn any on now. He dried his hands on a cloth and walked around the house aimlessly at first. He had done this many times in the last few months, hearing echoes. When he got to the area which had been Catherine's study, he stopped. There was nothing left in the space now, bar the empty desk and the empty bookshelves. He could tell that the chair had been moved, however. He didn't recall precisely how it had been when he'd last listlessly walked this way, but he knew that it had been moved somehow. He went back to walking and eventually fetched up outside the room that had been Matilda's. The door was slightly ajar. The space beyond was dark. He could feel a warmth coming out of it, though. Heard a sound in there, something quiet. He turned and walked slowly away. He took a shower in the dark. Afterward, he padded back to the kitchen in his bare feet and a gown and picked his scotch glass up from the draining board. Even after many, many trips through the dishwasher, you could see the ghost of the restaurant logo that had once been stamped on it. the remains of a mast and a crow's nest. Catherine had slipped it into a purse one long ago night, without him knowing about it, then given the glass to him as an anniversary present. How did a person who would do that change into the person now living half the state away? He didn't know any more than he knew why he had so little to say on the phone to his daughter, or why people sat and looked at views, or why they drove to nowhere on Saturday afternoons. Our heads turn and point at things. Light comes into our eyes. Words come out of our mouths. And then, and so. Carefully he brought the edge of the glass down upon the edge of the counter. It broke pretty much as he'd hoped it would. The base remained in one piece, the sides shattering into several jagged points. He padded back through into the bedroom, put the broken glass on the nightstand, took off the robe, and laid it on the bed. That's how they'd always done it, when they'd wanted to signal that tonight didn't have to just be about going to sleep. Under the covers with a book, probably not tonight, Josephine. Naked and on top, on the other hand, a shorthand, a shared language. It was a little sadder, however, than a tongue for which only one speaker remains. He closed his eyes, and after a while, for the first time since he'd stood stunned at the driveway and watched his family leave, he cried. Afterward he lay and waited. She came in the night. 3 days later, in the late afternoon, a battered truck pulled down into the driveway and parked alongside the car that was there. It was the first time the truck had been on the road in nearly 2 years. The driver left the engine running when he got out because he wasn't all that sure it would start up again. The patched front tire was holding up, though, for now. He went around the back and opened up the wooden crate, propping the flap with a stick. He walked over to the big front door and rang the bell. Waited a while and did it again. No answer. Of course. He rubbed his face in his hands wearily, took a step back. The door looked solid. No way a kick would get it open. He looked around and saw the steps up to the side deck. When he got around to the back of the house, he picked up the chair that sat by itself, hefted it to judge the weight, and threw it through the big glass door. When he'd satisfied himself that the hole in the smashed glass was big enough, he walked back along the deck, around the front, and then up the driveway, to stand on the road for a while out of view of the house. He smoked a cigarette, then another to be sure. When he came back down the driveway, he was relieved to see that the flap on the crate on the back of his truck was now closed. He climbed into the cab and sat a moment, looking at the big house. Then he put the truck into reverse, got back up to the highway, and drove slowly home. When he made the turn into his own drive later, the truck, he saw the stop sign was still there. Didn't matter how many times he told the boy, the sign was still there. He drove along the track to the house, parked the truck. He opened the crate without looking at it and went inside. Later, sitting on his porch in the darkness, he listened to the sound of the wind moving through the tops of the trees all around. He drank a warm beer, then another. He looked at the grime on his hands. He wondered what it was that made some people catch sight of the sign, what it was in their eyes, what it was in the way they looked that made them see. He wondered how the man in the big house had done it, hoped he had not suffered much. He wondered why he had never attempted the same thing. He wondered why it was only on nights like these he was able to remember that his boy had been dead 20 years. Finally, he went indoors and lay in bed staring at the ceiling. He did this every night, even though there was never anything there to see, nothing, unless it is that sad, dark thing that eventually takes us in its arms and makes us sleep.